You're in a place in which I rant. This rant is for Anime Watcher, who requested for me to rant about bad leftist tales. Tales that I have had as a leftist that are bad. And boy oh boy, I've been an internet leftist in some regard for a long time now. Probably if I want to trace it back real far, I'd go to 2015 when I was on Facebook, when the Bernie Sanders campaign started really hitting it off. And at this point, that would be, 4 years ago. I was a big fan. I was a very big Bernie fan at the time. Not so much anymore. I think a lot of his foreign policy is pretty bad. In the 80s and 70s, it used to be quite good, but he's regressed quite heavily over time. I think the bombing of Yugoslavia, for instance, was the real turning point in Bernie's career, where he became fairly imperialistic, as is everyone else in U.S. Congress now and at the time. Besides, I guess like now you have Ilhan Omar doing good stuff, but he's imperialistic in the Senate. He has some foreign policy stances that are quite good, like ending the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen and all these different things. But by and large, Bernie, there's a lot of problems with Bernie. Um, and while I think him as president could greatly benefit the country in a direct, quick kind of sense, social democracy, the uh, Scandinavian style system is ultimately not what I think would benefit the people the most. I think a system in which the people are in control of the state would be a system in which the people benefit the most. A system in which the means of production, the major centers of economic power, function for the needs of society, in which they are controlled by society themselves, to use that state power for public good, full employment, healthcare, education, and not having to make this money through imperialistic means. Because you look at someone like Bernie, and obviously you've got to bomb some countries to be able to extract their mineral wealth and their human resources to be able to pay for the social programs back at home. Sweden does this with many other companies in Africa. A lot of those companies grossly exploit people for cheap labor and have terrible working conditions and barely pay them anything. But that wealth that's extracted from those resources that are essentially stolen from those African countries by Swedish companies can have that money taxed by the state. And the state puts them in welfare programs back at home while everybody else has service sector jobs. Um, and one of the big problems that this causes with, in the realm of climate change, for instance, is that, um, you know, the people, the people end up not polluting so much at home, but in other countries which aren't theirs, they pollute a whole bunch because there are less environmental restrictions. And so you kind of create this illusion of fixing the planet when in fact you're actually just making it worse, while also uh, having a populace that's totally null and void in terms of wanting to fix the problem, because they're all first world people who are given their social welfare benefits, their free health care, their access to a jobs program. And so you can have these things, but they're always going to be done through exploitative means, and the private ownership of the means of production as well is an exploitative system until the state itself can be under control by the workers. And of course, you can have private industries under socialism, and I mean socialism in the Soviet, Cuban, Chinese context, not what Bernie talks about. But Bernie talks about a social democracy. But like, you can have private industries, but they ultimately have to be controlled by society. There has to be a strong element of worker control where profits themselves are not in command to to how society is governed. But in the Scandinavian countries, profits are in command. It's just that they mask that by having lots of taxation and social welfare. Um, but but I was very politically illiterate at the time, and so I was a big fan of Bernie. I was just kind of listening to what was on the television at the time, and big fan of $15 minimum wage and free healthcare and all these things. So I would post on Facebook all the time, and eventually some of these arguments I got into people with talking about the minimum wage, for instance, um, ended in me getting so frustrated that I'd make these large Facebook posts, just deriding everyone who disagreed with me, saying, Republicans are stupid, Democrats are the best, without even having an understanding that there was a corporate wing of the Democratic Party. I didn't even understand that. I just thought, Bernie's a Democrat and he's great. And he's like Obama, and Obama's great, and all this kind of virtue signaling, very basic understanding of what politics was. And so I would post, these Facebook pages like, I think it was the other 99% or something like that, and the Bernie Sanders official Facebook. I would post these things all the time. And I would get into debates with people pretty regularly because I would post about why we needed the $15 minimum wage. And I would get so frustrated that I would say incredibly incendiary, just kind of mean things to people, disrespectful things to people that, looking back, I would never say now unless I was in like a terrible mental state. But I said them because I was a stupid fucking kid, and I got mad. I got really mad when people didn't, as I perceived it to be at least, understand where I was coming from. And of course, now I have my outbursts every now and again when someone is being particularly rude or egregious, but by and large, I can argue with people if they're arguing in good faith. I won't get mad. A lot of these people would argue in good faith, and I would get mad anyway, and that was not okay. Um, and then as time goes on, 2016 rolls by and Trump gets elected, and my debating at this point is kind of going downhill. I had some arguments with people about the grab 'em by the pussy thing, and I got a little bit upset with some Trump supporters because they would say, "Oh, it's just a normal remark he made and stuff," and I was like, "No, it's misogynistic, yeah," and I would fight against people over that. And some people would say some pretty mean things, and I mean, it's the internet, it's Facebook. Well, what else would you expect? And I got pretty upset in some of those arguments. Um, and then I left Facebook, and I didn't really do much internet leftism at that point. Um, Throughout the rest of 2016, I wasn't apolitical. I still held the same views, but I went into kind of a political transition a little bit, became kind of more libertarian-y, kind of, and then I started dipping into some more authoritarian waters in parts of 2017. I don't have the full timeline. I used to have a political timeline of myself, like written out in front of me, but I know in early 2017, late 2016, I was kind of flirting with some ideas about overpopulation, which was a little bit weird. And so when we get to the summer of 2017, that was when I became what many on the internet would call a tanky. Yes, a Marxist-Leninist, communist, whatever you want to call it. And where this sprung about from was because I want to say was it April? I think it was April or May of 2017. So I just turned 15. It might have even been March. Fuck. I started watching this YouTuber called Zezizi, and I found this guy by searching up like socialism, communism, Marxism onto YouTube. And I found him, I believe it was off of a recommended video from Azure Scapegoat. And I found Azure Scapegoat because of the Socialism 101 website, which I had found from Googling, trying to learn about what the hell Marx thought about. And at this point, I was very anti-Marx, but the reason why I became or interested and wanted to learn about Marxism was because I would constantly make jokes on Discord about how stupid communism was, and I wanted to make my jokes more effective and like funny, so I wanted to understand the references to what I was talking about. And so what I did was I went to Wikipedia and I read all this stuff and I was like, oh, this Marx guy, he doesn't sound so bad. He doesn't sound like such a bad guy. And I kept reading and eventually I found the Socialism 101 website. And from there, I was like, wow, I actually agree with a lot of these ideas. These ideas sound good to me. And I end up going to Zezzi's channel, and I watch a bunch of his videos, and I find this video called Socialism Has Worked, and he talks about Yugoslavia. And I was like, wow, Josip Broz Tito, he hated Stalin, and the IMF gave the Yugoslavian socialist state loans, and America allied with them and stuff. These guys sound great, so maybe socialism can work. Um, and then I miraculously find Finnish Bolshevik, not in the summer of 2017, but before the summer started, basically. And I go, oh boy, okay. I have, there's a lot of things here I didn't understand. And I didn't, immediately become like a Stalin did nothing wrong kind of person or anything like that, but I became more sympathetic to the idea that Marxism-Leninism had a lot of great points, that the one-party state could be a democracy. That was something I did not know before. I didn't think you could have democracy in a one-party state, but apparently you could. And I started learning about, even from just like Wikipedia or looking in actual encyclopedias, about the industrialization of the Soviet Union. And I would watch these videos and I thought, well, this is kind of from a biased perspective. I don't know if I want to go full in on this, but I learned about the economic development of the Soviet Union, about how, they collectivized agriculture and agricultural output went up, and this ultimately resulted in ending the famines in the country, and how quickly they industrialized, from being like a completely backwards country in 1917, which had just been ravaged by not just World War One, but a revolution. Most of the infrastructure in a lot of places was destroyed. But before that point, Russia was known as this country that constantly had famines all the time because they didn't have tractors, and as a result of a lot of the land, not being farmable, the fact that they didn't have tractors, the fact that there wasn't like a easy system of transportation because the country was not industrialized, it was a semi-feudal country. They were completely backwards in the sense of the world, in the greater context of what the world considered to be developed. This is why Russia was considered to be a joke among most countries, and this is also why China was considered to be like the sick man of Asia. Um, and then with Stalin's 5 year industrial plan, in 4 years, not even in five, in 4 years, they achieved the industrialization of the USSR. And I was looking at this and I was going, what the fuck? How did that happen? How did that quickly how did they that quickly industrialize a country that was entirely backwards? How did they modernize the military so quickly? How did they, collectivize agriculture, ultimately resulting in the end of famines in a country that was famine ridden for hundreds of years? And I was like, well, there had to be a problem here, maybe they just industrialized so quickly because of the Gulag. I look in the Gulag and it only accounted for, not even 10% of the overall labor. It was a very small amount. I think it was something like, like 2 to 3%. It was a really small amount. So the Gulag wasn't the reason why they industrialized so quickly. And I thought, well, okay, maybe it was because of famine. Maybe they had intentionally not fed people in order to industrialize that fast. And that turned out to not be true. Holodomor was caused by, bad weather conditions. And then a number of the other famines were caused by just bad conditions in general, a lack of development, a lack of tractors, you know, um, the fact that the country wasn't super well connected at this point. So I was looking through all this stuff, the fact that they didn't have modernized farming the way that other countries did due to just how backwards it was. Um, and the fact that like the kulaks in the country would regularly burn stocks of food because they supported the white army and wanted capitalist restoration so they could continue having their power as a stronger class, and they didn't want these peasants to own the grain and the food. They didn't want them to eat, so they just burned and hoarded their food. And so once I started learning that the famines were caused by these other factors, um, and the fact that they had to develop that quickly because they were potentially going to be invaded by the United States and these other nations, which did not recognize the Soviet Union officially. The Soviet Union was not recognized until after World War II as a nation, and the United States was one of the countries that invaded them. During the Russian Revolution, among like 17 other ones, including France. So there was big problems. And when I learned that the massive amounts of development in that country were achieved through socialist means, the fastest growing economy in the 20th century and one of the fastest in the history of the world, and the fact that they were able to develop so much so quickly, even enough to beat the Nazis in such a short period of time, blew my mind because no other country had been able to do that except for other socialist ones. And the idea of such a backwards nation being taken out of poverty in such a short span of time, the idea that many of these Russian people had to sleep on planks. They had to sleep in these dirty homes of a bunch of people being crammed together on these planks. They had 2,000 houses that were completely empty after the Russian Revolution that they just opened up to the people. The Bolsheviks just said, "Here, have them. Get in these houses. No longer will you languish in these damp and sterile hard conditions." When I started learning all of these things and when all of the information came together, I didn't deny Katyn or anything like that. I do now because it's a Nazi propaganda. Katyn's not a thing that the Bolsheviks did. But when I started piecing all of this together and learning more about how Marxism-Leninism worked, I called myself a Marxist-Leninist. And I pretty unapologetically defended the USSR as well as these other states. But I acknowledge that they made mistakes. And as I would always say, yeah, I'm not like a complete Stalin apologist. I realize he probably did some pretty bad things. And it was as my research continued going, as I continued learning about how these states function and who these people were, that I took a more positive view of them because I had checked the citations in those books, because I had read more credible sources, because I had looked at where the information was coming from, whether it was a secondary or primary source, whether it was being described in a legitimate fashion, if it was being misquoted, and so on. And so I just kept learning, and eventually I came to the conclusion that these states were even better than I thought they were in the beginning when I was looking at this very rudimentary understanding of history of they industrialized really fast, and that was pretty cool. And so I've only become more of an ML as time has gone on, as I've learned more things. But the embarrassing thing, and this is getting back to the idea of, bad leftist stories of how bad things really are. Um, is that when I was learning in 2017, and I guess in the earlier part of 2018, is that I would regularly get in debates with people who I knew, unable to properly defend myself, And I just straight up would not have a response to a lot of the things people would say. One of the common criticisms that I got from a former friend at the time was that Lashenko, the madman, madman farm biologist guy, was the reason for the famines, which is a totally ludicrous claim because his research was relegated to a fairly small number of crops in comparison to what was being constructed in the USSR. Like his research was not implemented on all of the food that was being grown. He was just kind of a fringe researcher. And so this idea that his weird experimentation with differing ideas on biology and kind of changing the way that you think about plants would somehow led to the famine was totally ludicrous. But I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know anything about Lashenko, and I'm still sort of piecing together the story behind that. But I know it wasn't the fucking reason for the famines. But like at the time, I just didn't have a response. My only response would be, well, the USSR industrialized really fast, and that's good, and they beat the Nazis, and that's good, and also they gave everyone housing, universal housing, that's good, universal jobs, that's good, women the right to vote, whoa, pretty cool. They had majority Muslim republics, and those Muslims weren't oppressed anymore. Wow, super cool. Hey, did you know they could have Sharia law for minor offenses in the USSR? That's freedom of choice right there, bro. You can choose to go to Soviet courts or Sharia courts. Whoa, did you know that minority Soviet republics can veto any law that the Supreme Soviet makes, and that means that you can stop racist legislation from passing? Whoa, super cool, bro. Whoa, did you know that the Jewish autonomous region was established by Stalin, Beardo by Jean? Yeah, dude, anti-Semitism is totally not based, and that's what the Tsar did. Whoa, dude, look at these Yiddish secular schools being built by Lenin, bro. So much progressivism, so cool. And those things were all 100% true, but they were not able to deflect the core argument that this person would make. And so I would end up making myself look like I would just move the goalpost because I didn't have a proper refutation of his points. And in order to kind of save my own stance as I thought I would be doing, which didn't really work, I would instead mention a bunch of positive things. Or, and this is even worse, I would result to whataboutism. Now, whataboutism is a pretty common arguing tactic on both the left and the right. People accused Pravada of doing a lot of whataboutism, in the 1980s and 70s, and Pravada was the Soviet newspaper, which was basically just a propaganda arm of the state. But people would say, oh, Pravada's using whataboutism by saying, what about these capitalist countries that do the same things we do? And then that would be a bad argument, basically. But whataboutism is done on all sides, regardless of where the term popularly originated from. And so what I would do is I would say, oh, what about capitalism? What about capitalism doing this? And what about when the United States does this? And I would result to that constantly because I wouldn't have an argument. And as a result of using this very poor form of argumentation, this argument fallacy, I would end up making myself look really, really dumb because I wouldn't have a refutation of their point. I would just deflect the point, or at least attempt to, by moving the goalpost, moving the conversation to another topic. Look, capitalism does the same thing. Yeah, I know my system does the same thing, but that doesn't change my critique of your system. Well, you're a hypocrite because your system does the same thing. Well, not really, because I don't want my system to do it, and I have the same criticism of your system. And just back and forth like that, but in less civil and more silly terms. And so the conversation would end up going at 50 bajillion movements per second, and no one would be understanding what anyone else would say. I guess the other cringeworthy arguments I've had, and this was more so in like the mid portion of 2018 to even now to an extent, but now I'm kind of better at defending the DPRK, was that I would be talking about the international situation surrounding North Korea. A lot of people would say sanctions on North Korea are good because Kim Jong Un bad. And well, I certainly wouldn't disagree that North Korea has a lot of problems. There's certainly some non democratic elements there, but I wouldn't say that North Korea isn't a democratic state either. It is. You know, the structure of it is. There's actually CIA documents. If you go to the CIA website, there are documents from 19, I believe it's 92, 93. It might have been 95. It was a little bit before Kim Il Sung died, but not too far, or it was after Kim Jong Il became president. I don't remember. There's documents that are fairly new, in the grand scheme of things, at least, that explain the structure of the North Korean state. There's a Anna Louise Strong article from 1950, which in depth explains the voting process in North Korea that she observed while she was there. There's a number of pieces. You know, you can find the Constitution online. You can find footage of people voting and stuff. Um, you know, you can. There's a lot of misinformation surrounding the DPRK. There's no shortage of images and video of people being, you know, quite normal, quite happy. Economic information you can find on how the workers' democracy works in the state-run companies in the DPRK. They do have special economic zones that have some private enterprise and stuff. They have a trade fair. But in general, it's by and large, you know, uh, democratically owned by the people. You know, quite good pensions. There's universal housing. You don't have to pay taxes, and you know, healthcare is free. With the little bit that they have, due to the embargo, due to the ginormous sanctions, with the little bit they have, they do take care of the people. They take care of each other, and there's a lot of just amazing infrastructure projects that were built in North Korea, um, that you know, with any other country that wasn't socialist wouldn't have been able to be built. Now, you take any other country. North Korea in 2016 had 3.7% economic growth, whereas South Korea, I believe it was like 2.8%, something like that. It was a lower number. Um, and this was at the height of the sanctions. You know, they had been sanctioned more than ever, and yet their economy was growing more than the South. And it's because socialist central planning is just better at economic growth. You don't have economic crashes with socialist central planning, unless you know, you're completely embargoed and sanctioned to death, and there's like a war going on or something, and there's general complications in management. But it's rare. It's incredibly rare for that to happen. And so, with their centrally planned economy and now with their nuclear weapons program, they've moved away from the military first policy of Saigon and have used that wealth generation to benefit the people, to build more schools, build more parks for the people, you know, give more educational opportunities, and so on and so forth. You know, try and innovate in the farming sector because so much of North Korea is unarable in terms of the land, um, that they've had to get incredibly creative to be able to farm the food. And the monsoons don't make it easy either because a lot of the mountains lead to flooding, which destroys the crops regularly. And you can find on countrystudies.org, there's a page on North Korea which talks about the effects of the bombings, on North Korean agriculture, which is pretty bad. I believe it talks about the monsoons on there as well. So I would have these arguments with people. They're talking about the nature of the North Korean state, and I would attempt to argue that socialist central planning did provide for the people quite well, using photo evidence, economic graphs, these kind of things. The fact that they, ate better than a lot of maritime and Southeast Asian countries, trying to use the data that I had on hand to disprove these ideas. And the response I would always get was, North Korea is capitalist, or I would get told it's a totalitarian place, and so you can't make these arguments. And I didn't even fully deny that it was, because there's obviously an authoritarian slant in the country. You can't deny that. But for what reason was also important to me. The reason they are is because historically they are an oppressed nation in the international sphere. What are you going to do if your country is constantly under the threat of war and siege by the United States? You're probably going to have less than lax security policies. And so I would get into these arguments with people, and I would try to use the economic data to back up my point that with a full scale embargo and sanctions, they're still able to provide wealth for the people because of socialism, while also claiming that the totalitarian nature of the state is not an inherent thing in Marxism, but it was historically necessary in the Korean context to protect the revolution as a whole. And I also attempted to demonstrate that the people were fine with that. And one of the ways in which I tried to demonstrate that was the fact that the people had access to shit tons of guns and artillery. This is not according to a North Korean source. This is according to the South Korean government. And so, theoretically, if the people wanted to, if they were oh so oppressed and hated it, they would just overthrow the North Korean state with guns and artillery that they readily have access to, that everyone has training to use. And you would not see nearly as many North Koreans defecting to to North Korea when they defected to South Korea due to the economic incentive that's in place. Where I think last year they actually tripled the money that you would receive as a South Korean defector. The reason they do this is so you'll leave your country, and then by the time you get there, you won't have good housing opportunities. And so, in order to make money, you'll go to reporters and you'll lie. You'll give one of these dramatic, emotional talks about how terrible the North was, and then you'll make money that way. There was actually a North Korean defector who wrote a book, who admonished his own book. He said, "My book was a lie, that I only wrote this book in order to make money." Because he had to. When you get into South Korea, it's a capitalist hellhole. You have to lie about your situation as a North Korea to the sensationalist media who will eat that shit up because you will not have money otherwise. You go to South Korea because you feel like it's going to have higher economic opportunities because they're increasing the amount of money they're going to pay you to do it. And even with those incentives in place, so many of these people tried to defect back to the North, gave even more emotional interviews about the fact that they couldn't receive the proper health care for their cancer treatments, for instance, and they wanted to go back to the North so they could have the socialized medicine. There are many, many cases of this happening. One good documentary is Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang in Seoul, where they give these multiple interviews of these North Korean people who are quite articulate and able to get their thoughts out without sounding like propaganda pieces, which is one of the many absurd claims that these people tend to make against North Korean testimonies in favor of the state, is that they're just brainwashed. These people seem to have a quite nuanced and articulate view of their country. They just supported it. And there's a lot of these people who just support it. And for good reason, because they had better pensions, they had better housing, they didn't have to be homeless, and they didn't have the same luxury items, but they were able to get a good living. They were able to get by on what they had. They were able to make it by sharing what they had, even if it was a little. And that's the primary difference between capitalism. In capitalism, you have accumulation through destruction. People get rich off of making other people poor. In socialism, everyone isn't equal necessarily. The value of your labor is ultimately determined by the labor time and so on. and you get a wage based on the labor value that you put in, but the disparities in wealth are not so large, generally speaking. Now, if you look at a country like China, where they have a policy similar to Lenin's new economic policy, in which semi-state capitalist institutions are instituted in order to generate development and develop the productive forces forward, that's obviously going to be different than a fully automated socialist country like the DPRK, which has much less disparities in wealth. The Soviet Union had much less disparities in wealth. But China's a specific case that I'll talk about at another time. A very specific case. Vietnam and Laos are the same way. But so the difference is going to be that in a capitalist country, you have rich people getting rich off of making other people poor. But in a socialist country, you have the resources that are generated by the country, the wealth that's generated by the country, is shared among the people. It's determined by the people as to what will be needed for the people. And so when you have a democratic, dare I say, egalitarian state, you're going to have a situation in which the people are more effectively taken care of. Um, and so, uh, so I would get into these arguments with people all the time, kind of being unable to explain some of these, what are considered to be more extreme positions, more kind of fringe positions, with the evidence that I had. And I would always end up getting upset or getting stressed during the debates, and not really knowing how to argue for my position, because when I would get angry or upset or embarrassed, because a lot of the time these would be done in a server where like other people were watching, so I couldn't really sit down and formulate a response because I felt like I had to get it out really fast because I was nervous. I would forget certain key pieces of information. And that would embarrass me heavily because I would be arguing for something that like a lot of other people wouldn't argue for. So I kind of had to be the spokesperson for an entire nation, which is actively being killed by sanctions right now. Medicine is being kept out of the country because of this view of it as a totalitarian dictatorship, that somehow they're humanitarian sanctions. It's a humanitarian war starving children. Um, and so I felt like I had a moral obligation to clarify these lies, these blatant falsehoods against the country. Um, and as a result of that pressure, that social pressure, that moral pressure, I would just cave in and get upset and not know how to necessarily argue for my stance. And even recently, this has happened to me, where I got so mad arguing with a guy about the socialist status of China that I completely forgot about the Workers' Congress in China, which in state-run companies, which make up the majority of the economy nonetheless, in state-run companies, you have a workers' congress which democratically decides, many of the operations of the industries. And this contrasts quite starkly with many of the domestic firms that are privately owned in the country, which are, firmly under trade union control. They have the All China Trade Union, and the state, democratically controlled by the workers, is able to mandate its power through an economic plan, where even with the private institutions, which are primarily there to develop the productive forces of the country, what you have is a situation in which state power is being wielded through a 5-year economic plan. That the irrationality of the market and the dictatorship of profits, um, ultimately are kept at bay because a 5-year economic plan subordinates production to an extent that would allow production to be carried out with the benefits of the people in mind. Um, and so even with private industries, of which they do not compose the majority of industries in China, those are themselves controlled by the workers. It's just in a different way. But the state industries, there's a ton of worker control in the state industries. And so I got into an argument with this guy, and there were so many details I forgot to mention. And I was just making myself look really bad because there's so much stuff. Like, this is the problem with being an ML on the internet, or really anywhere, is that I've been doing this for 2 years now. When I was a social democrat, it was embarrassing because I didn't know how to argue for my points. But being a social democrat is fucking easy. You can destroy conservatives as a social democrat, no problem. Being being a fucking, tanky, as most people would label me, a dengist, a Juche gang supporter, a Stalinist, or one of these other labels people give me, it's so hard to be able to have all of the information on hand because I know what the correct stances are because I've done the research for hours and hours on it. Like, I read about this stuff every day. I've been reading about this stuff every day for more than 2 years now. And so I have a comprised worldview in place that I've been building on and building on, and I've debunked many of the anti-communist lies through just checking what their sources are, through trying really, really hard to see the falsehoods in what they're saying, or to see the truth in what they're saying, and sort of coalescing all of these different anti-communist sources, finding the truth in them, to be able to combine them together to find the truth. It's like when Chomsky talks about reading the news. Well, you can't really find the truth in one specific article, but if you read all of it, and if you turn it sideways, move it around, if you look all over the place, eventually you find a semblance of the truth. You have to be very literate. You have to look and look and look and look, and it's not a game. It's a months, years long process that you have to be willing to work hard as fuck at every single day to try and find out what the truth is. And you're not going to get that from just directly looking at the media. But the truth it's often in the media if you just look hard enough. And so you have to have an understanding of how the media works, of how to break down the media into parts, and of how to check sources. And I would just do this constantly. But the problem is that once you get an understanding of the context behind these situations and of what really happened, is that there's so much information to remember that now you have to have it all written down. You have to have all these links, all these arguments, all these sources just in files on hand for arguments for when they come up. And that's difficult. That's difficult to always have. And as a pretty emotional person, when people blatantly misrepresent arguments that I have, that I've put a Herculean amount of effort into checking to see if they're true, and into trying as hard as I can to make them as coherent as I can, for myself, to have people, blatantly misrepresent those arguments and be rude, it's easy to get upset, and to give to give more emotional arguments, and then forget key points of information that would have otherwise saved the argument, would have otherwise won the argument in my favor. And once you allow yourself to get emotional as a result of being misrepresented, being misunderstood, then now, all of that time that you spent trying to figure this stuff out is all for naught, because you just forgot it right there. So it's quite difficult. It takes a lot of effort.